What if the forest you trusted to shelter you was already watching you? That's the thought that lodged itself into Melissa's mind as the headlights of their SUV flickered against the towering trees of Black Hollow Forest. The trunks stood like stone pillars, and the leaves above knitted together so thickly that even the moonlight seemed afraid to enter. She had heard stories about these woods, a place where campers disappeared without a trace, but tonight, she and her 3 friends were determined to spend the weekend proving that the tales were nothing but backwoods superstition. The group was mismatched in more ways than one. Melissa, cautious but curious, had always been the one who read too much into shadows. Her boyfriend, Jared, was the opposite, loud, overconfident, and determined to laugh at every warning sign. Then there was Lila, the eternal optimist who insisted nature was beautiful no matter how dangerous it looked, and finally, Marcus, the quiet one who rarely spoke but whose eyes often lingered on things too long, as if he saw something the rest of them didn't. They arrived just before midnight, their tires crunching over gravel until the road finally ended in a small clearing. The air was unnervingly still. No crickets. No wind. Just the low hum of their engine. "Feels like we're not supposed to be here," Melissa muttered, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack. "That's the point." Jared grinned. "Spooky camping trip, remember? You'll see, by morning, this'll be just another bunch of trees." But even as he said it, a heavy silence pressed on them. The forest wasn't just quiet, it was expectant. They set up camp quickly, pitching 2 tents side by side while the beam of Marcus's flashlight danced along the tree line. Every time Melissa glanced at him, he wasn't looking at the tents or the firewood. He was staring deeper into the forest, jaw tight, as if listening to something none of them could hear. When the fire finally roared to life, sparks snapping in the air, the group settled in. Lila pulled out marshmallows, Jared opened a cooler of beer, and Melissa tried to shake the crawling unease in her stomach. Still, it was almost possible to relax, until Marcus spoke. "You know the legend, right?" His voice was low, almost drowned by the crackle of the flames. Jared rolled his eyes. "Here we go." But Melissa leaned forward. "What legend?" Marcus's flashlight rested on the ground, beam angled just far enough to illuminate his face from below. "People say the forest doesn't like strangers. It waits. Watches. Sometimes, when it takes someone, the others don't even notice they're gone. They'll swear their friend was sitting right beside them, until they look again and realize they've been talking to empty air." A shiver crept across Melissa's arms. Lila gave a nervous laugh. "That's just to scare kids." Marcus didn't smile. "Maybe." They let the fire die down, one by one crawling into their tents. Melissa and Jared shared one, while Lila and Marcus took the other. The forest around them remained oppressively silent. Melissa woke some time later, throat dry, the kind of thirst that gnawed until it couldn't be ignored. She slipped out of the tent quietly, careful not to wake Jared, and crossed to the cooler. The moon had finally broken through the canopy, casting pale streaks of light that made the clearing glow. That's when she noticed it, Lila's tent flap was open. Melissa frowned, stepping closer. The inside of the tent was empty. No sleeping bag. No backpack. Just the faint impression of someone having once lain there. She turned, a chill gripping her spine. "Lila," she whispered into the trees. The forest didn't answer. Melissa's flashlight beam trembled as she swept it across the clearing. The shadows between the trees seemed thicker now, alive somehow, like they were leaning in to listen. And then, movement. A figure, pale, drifting slowly between the trunks. It looked like Lila, but wrong, her arms hanging too loosely at her sides, her head tilted unnaturally. Melissa's breath caught. She opened her mouth to call out, but the words froze when she saw Marcus. He was standing just beyond the tree line, half hidden, his eyes locked on her. And he wasn't alone. There were shapes in the dark behind him. Many shapes. Watching. The flashlight flickered once, then died. For a moment, Melissa stood frozen in the clearing, her breath tight in her chest, as the beam of her flashlight sputtered and vanished. The darkness pressed in instantly, thick and merciless, as if the forest itself had swallowed the fragile light whole. Her ears strained for sound, but the silence of Black Hollow was absolute, no insects, no rustling leaves, only the dull hammering of her own heartbeat. Her eyes adjusted slowly to the weak glow of the moon filtering through the treetops, enough to make out the pale figure that resembled Lila. It moved strangely, gliding more than walking, its head lolling as though the neck bones could no longer hold it steady. Melissa wanted desperately to believe it was her friend stumbling in half-sleep, maybe looking for the bathroom or wandering dazed, but the way the body tilted, it was wrong. Every instinct screamed at her not to call out again. And then she remembered Marcus. He was still there, just beyond the tree line, watching her with a stillness that was more terrifying than anything else. People shifted when they stood, swayed, adjusted weight, blinked. But Marcus remained rooted, his body too rigid, his face barely visible yet clearly turned toward her. Behind him, those darker shapes hung like shadows that refused to disperse. She couldn't tell how many there were, 3, maybe 5, but they seemed to multiply the longer she stared. Her throat burned with thirst, but the water she had come for was forgotten. She stumbled backward, fumbling for the tent, almost tripping over her own feet. The flap whispered as she yanked it open and slid inside, heart clattering against her ribs. Jared stirred, groggy, blinking at her silhouette. "Melissa? What the hell are you doing?" His voice was thick with sleep, but his irritation was clear. She crouched beside him, whispering harshly. "Lila's gone. And Marcus, he's out there." "He's not, Jared, there's something out there with him." Jared frowned, sitting up, rubbing his eyes. "Slow down. What are you talking about?" But Melissa couldn't slow down. Her words tumbled out in a panicked rush, about the open tent, the empty space, the pale figure, Marcus staring with something, or someone, lurking just behind. Jared groaned and pulled on his jacket. "Jesus, Melissa. It's probably nothing. Lila probably went to pee. Marcus is probably keeping watch. You let your imagination get the better of you." She grabbed his arm, nails digging in. "No, you don't understand. I saw them. There were others out there." But Jared only shook her off and unzipped the tent. The cold air rushed in as he stepped out. Melissa followed against her better judgment, unwilling to be left alone in the tent. The clearing was empty again. The moonlight had shifted, casting long beams that cut across the ground, but there was no sign of Marcus or the strange figure. Lila's tent flap now hung closed, as if untouched. Even the footprints she thought she'd seen in the dirt were gone. Jared turned to her, smirking in that way that always made her want to slap him. "See? Nothing. Just the woods playing tricks. Go back to sleep before you freak yourself out more." Melissa's stomach churned. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if it clung to her skin. She knew what she'd seen. She wasn't crazy. Reluctantly, she crawled back into the tent with Jared, though her nerves wouldn't allow her to close her eyes. She lay there, staring at the thin nylon above her, listening to Jared's breathing slow into snores. She wanted to believe it was over, that she'd only been imagining, but the silence outside told her otherwise. Hours stretched painfully slow. At some point, she drifted into a restless sleep. When she woke again, pale sunlight was bleeding into the tent. Jared was gone. Panic struck instantly. She scrambled out, blinking against the morning haze. The fire pit was cold, the cooler closed, both tents standing exactly as they had the night before. But Jared was nowhere. Neither was Marcus. Neither was Lila. The clearing was empty. Melissa's breath quickened as she spun in circles, calling their names, her voice cracking with every shout. The trees swallowed her words. No response came back, not even an echo. And then she saw it. Something carved into the dirt, right in the center of the camp. A perfect circle, freshly etched, the soil darker as if it had been burned. At the edge of the circle lay Jared's jacket, folded neatly. Melissa's stomach twisted as she picked it up, the fabric ice cold, damp with something that wasn't water. and that's when the sound came. Not from the forest, but from inside Lila's tent. A long, dragging breath. Melissa turned slowly, her skin crawling, the tent flap trembling as if something inside was waiting for her. Melissa's knees felt like water as she stood frozen in the clearing, staring at the faint quiver of Lila's tent. That sound, low, wet, and rasping, rose and fell as though some massive creature were breathing inside. The air around her seemed to pulse with it, as if the forest itself were inhaling and exhaling in sync with whatever was hidden beneath that thin veil of nylon. Her mind screamed at her to run, to leave everything behind and bolt into the daylight. But another part of her, the part still tethered to Jared, Lila, and Marcus, refused to move. What if one of them was in there? What if Jared had only gone inside to grab something and she was about to abandon him to the forest? Swallowing hard, Melissa crouched, her trembling hand reaching for the zipper of the tent. She hesitated, her fingers brushing the cold metal. The breathing inside stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable, thick enough to crush her chest. She thought she heard a faint giggle, high, distorted, like the sound of a child trapped in a broken toy. Lila? Her voice was barely audible, trembling. The tent walls shuddered violently, as if someone had struck them from inside. Melissa stumbled back, falling onto the dirt. The flap unzipped on its own, slow, deliberate, the teeth of the zipper grinding together in the still morning air. What came out wasn't Lila. At first, it looked like her, same hair, same frame, but her movements were jerky, unnatural. Her skin was pale, slick with a damp sheen, and her eyes were empty sockets, black hollows that reflected nothing. She crawled forward on all fours, head twitching at sharp angles, like a marionette jerked by invisible strings. Melissa scrambled to her feet, backing toward the trees. Her body screamed to turn and run, but the thing that wore Lila's face tilted its head, sniffing the air like a predator savoring prey. Then, in a voice that sounded like three voices layered on top of each other, it whispered. "You weren't supposed to see." Melissa spun and ran. She didn't look back, didn't care about the backpack or the camp or even where her feet landed. Branches whipped her arms and face, roots snagged her shoes, but she kept going, deeper into black hollow forest. Her breath tore from her throat in ragged bursts until the clearing was long gone behind her. Only when her legs finally buckled did she stop. She collapsed against a fallen tree, clutching her knees, trying to force oxygen back into her lungs. The forest was darker here, the canopy so thick that morning light barely seeped through. She had no sense of direction, no idea which way led back to the road. But then, faintly, she heard Jared's voice. "Melissa. Over here." Her head snapped up. Relief flooded her veins. She stumbled to her feet, spinning in circles until she saw him, Jared, standing among the trees just 20 feet away. His face was pale, eyes wide, his hands raised in desperate urgency. "Thank God," she choked, stumbling toward him. "Where have you been? What happened?" But as she got closer, her relief curdled into dread. Jared wasn't moving. His lips weren't forming the words she heard. He just stood there, rigid, his mouth slightly open, eyes glassy. And yet his voice echoed through the forest again, calling her name, begging her to follow. Melissa froze. Her stomach dropped. Something was using his face, his image, like bait. Behind Jared, just barely visible between the trees, other faces were beginning to emerge. Dozens of them. Some she recognized, Marcus, Lila, but others were strangers. Men and women with hollow eyes and slack jaws, their mouths open in silent screams. They stood in rows, lifeless mannequins with bodies too stiff to be human. Melissa staggered back, her mind fracturing under the weight of what she was seeing. She turned to flee again, only to trip on something hard buried under the leaves. Her hands brushed it, and her stomach dropped further. It was a boot. Jared's boot. Still attached to a leg. The rest of his body was half buried in the soil, twisted unnaturally, as if the forest had been trying to swallow him whole. His face, his real face, was slack, drained of color, mouth frozen mid-scream. Melissa screamed, scrambling back, when suddenly, the forest answered her. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was the trees themselves groaning, the ground trembling, the air vibrating with a guttural hum that seemed to crawl inside her skull. Words shaped themselves within the sound, ancient and jagged, though Melissa somehow understood them. You are mine now. The earth beneath her shuddered violently, splitting in a jagged crack. Roots shot upward like skeletal hands, curling toward her ankles. Melissa tried to run, but the roots coiled faster, wrapping around her legs, dragging her down into the dirt. She clawed at the ground, screaming, fingernails tearing on stones, but the forest was relentless, swallowing her inch by inch. And just before the soil covered her face, she heard Lila's distorted voice again, close, right beside her ear. You should never have come here. Melissa awoke with dirt in her mouth. It clung to her tongue, bitter and damp, filling her throat with the taste of rot. For one awful moment, she thought she had been buried alive, that her desperate thrashing had failed and she was now entombed in the earth of Black Hollow. But when she opened her eyes, she found herself lying in a cavernous hollow space beneath the ground. The walls were alive. Roots ran across them like veins, thick and pulsating with a faint reddish glow. They seemed to breathe, contracting and expanding with a slow rhythm, as though the earth itself possessed lungs. Strange spores drifted through the air, glowing faintly, making the darkness shimmer with an otherworldly haze. The air was wet, warm, almost suffocating, and every inhale filled her nose with the sour musk of decay. Melissa staggered upright, brushing clumps of soil from her clothes. Her chest still burned with panic, but the silence down here was somehow worse than above. It was not the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of something waiting. As her eyes adjusted, she saw she wasn't alone. Bodies. Dozens of them, maybe hundreds, half embedded in the dirt walls. Men, women, even children. Their faces protruded from the soil as if they had been swallowed and preserved mid-scream. Some had eyes wide open, others sealed shut, but all were lifeless, their skin pulled tight over bone. Roots pierced through their flesh, threading into mouths, eye sockets, and chests, tethering them like grotesque marionettes. Melissa's stomach lurched violently. She staggered back, hand covering her mouth, but her heel struck something soft. She turned and froze. Jared. Or what was left of him. His body was slumped against the wall, chest torn open by twisting roots that pulsed through his ribs like arteries. His eyes flickered faintly, the pupils dilating and contracting, as if something was still trying to use him. When his lips moved, no sound came, only the faint wheeze of air forced out by the roots inside him. Melissa dropped to her knees beside him, tears stinging her eyes. No, 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 she whispered, shaking him gently. Jared, I'm here, please, fight it. For a moment, his hand twitched, fingers brushing hers weakly. Then his body convulsed, head snapping back, and a voice that was not his poured out, deep and resonant, vibrating through the chamber. We feed. We remember. We keep. Melissa scrambled backward, her hands slamming against the cavern wall. The corpses embedded in the roots shuddered all at once, mouths opening in unison to release a long, hollow moan that shook the air. It was not human, it was the forest speaking through them, a chorus of voices woven together into one terrifying song. Her pulse thundered. She bolted, running deeper into the hollow. The walls curved and twisted, forming a labyrinth of tunnels carved by roots and decay. Every turn revealed more of the same, faces frozen in soil, eyes pleading for help that never came, bodies half consumed, as if the forest was digesting them slowly, savoring every fragment of their humanity. And then she saw Marcus. Unlike the others, Marcus was not yet consumed. He stood at the center of a chamber, perfectly still, his eyes open but distant, glowing faintly with that same reddish light. Roots coiled around his arms and legs, holding him upright like a puppet on strings. His lips moved rhythmically, whispering words she couldn't understand, the language guttural and ancient. Melissa called out his name, her voice trembling. For a split second, his gaze flicked to her, sharp and clear, the Marcus she knew. Run, he rasped, his voice raw. You can't stop it. You can't. Before he could finish, his head jerked violently, snapping to one side as if yanked by invisible wires. His mouth twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. And when he spoke again, it was no longer Marcus's voice. She stays. She feeds us. She becomes us. The roots around him tightened, and the ground beneath her feet shuddered again. The cavern walls seemed to close in, pulsing with hunger. Melissa stumbled backward, her chest heaving, searching desperately for an exit. And then she saw it. At the far end of the chamber, beyond the rows of hollow-eyed corpses, a narrow tunnel glowed with faint daylight. Hope flared in her chest like a spark. She didn't think, she ran. Behind her, the forest roared, a guttural sound that shook the very bones of the earth. The bodies wailed in unison, their cries stretching into a cacophony of anguish. Marcus's laughter, hollow and broken, echoed through the tunnel as she sprinted. The light grew brighter, closer, until she burst from the earth and into the open air. She collapsed onto the forest floor, gasping, sobbing, dirt clinging to her skin. For a moment, she thought she was free. But then she realized. This wasn't the clearing where they had camped. The trees here were wrong, twisted into spirals, their bark blackened and oozing sap that glistened like blood. The air smelled sweeter, but sickening, like rotting fruit. And the silence was thicker than before, heavier, as if the forest had followed her here. Melissa staggered to her feet, turning in frantic circles, desperate for any sign of a road, a trail, anything. That's when she saw the trees ahead of her. Dozens of them, tall and ancient, their bark splitting in strange patterns. At first, she thought it was just weathering. But as she looked closer, her stomach dropped. The patterns weren't cracks. They were faces. Her friends' faces. Jared, Lila, Marcus. Their features warped into the wood, mouths frozen in silent screams, eyes wide with endless terror. And behind them, countless others. Men, women, children. All swallowed by the trees, their souls etched into the forest itself. Melissa stumbled back, tears blurring her vision. The faces seemed to move, stretching and straining against the bark, as though trying to break free. Some even mouthed her name. And then, in the stillness, she heard it again. That chorus of voices, seeping from the trees all around her, wrapping around her mind like vines. You can never leave. The forest exhaled. And the trees began to move. Melissa's scream ripped from her throat, swallowed instantly by the forest as the trees shifted, groaning like ancient bones. Their trunks twisted and bent, faces etched into the bark straining as though trying to peel themselves free. The branches above shook without wind, clattering like skeletal fingers. Every instinct in her body screamed that the forest was alive, not just alive, but aware, watching her, hungering for her. She staggered backward, stumbling over roots that snaked up from the soil as though trying to trip her. Her chest heaved, air burning in her lungs. This isn't real, she told herself. It can't be real. But the faces carved into the wood followed her, their mouths opening wider, eyes stretching unnaturally, and from those hollow mouths came a whisper in unison. Stay, stay, stay. Melissa clutched her ears, shaking her head violently. She turned and ran, plunging deeper into the warped grove. The forest seemed to rearrange itself around her, trees bending inward, paths curling back on themselves. No matter how fast she moved, she always seemed to end up circling back to the same clearing, the same screaming faces in the trunks. Exhaustion clawed at her muscles, but panic kept her moving until her legs finally gave out. She collapsed against a tree, her palm pressing into the bark for balance. The surface was warm, too warm, and it pulsed faintly under her touch like a living artery. Then, with a sickening realization, she felt something move beneath the bark, pressing outward against her palm. A hand. Melissa yanked back just as a human hand pushed through the wood, fingernails splintering as it clawed for freedom. The face in the bark beside it shifted violently, eyes rolling toward her. It was Jared's face, warped and pained, but undeniably his. His mouth opened wide, and his voice came through, broken and layered with echoes. Help me. Melissa, please." Her vision blurred with tears. She pressed both hands against the bark, sobbing. "I'm here. I'm here, Jared, I'll get you out, I swear." But the face twisted, smile stretching unnaturally until it split the bark wide open. Jared's voice was replaced by something deeper, something guttural and ancient. "You cannot free what is already part of us." The hand retreated, the bark sealing over again, leaving Melissa shaking violently, her body hollow with despair. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure emerging from the shadows. At first she thought it was Marcus again, but no, the shape was wrong. The figure was taller, broader, with features that shifted like smoke, its body made from writhing roots and bark. Its face, however, was eerily human, though it constantly morphed between different visages: Jared, Marcus, Lila, strangers she didn't know, all blending into one ever-changing mask. Melissa stumbled back as the figure approached. The ground shuddered beneath its steps. When it spoke, the voices of hundreds spilled from its shifting mouth. "We are the Hollow. We take. We keep. We feed. You entered our body, and now you belong to us." Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Why? Why us?" she screamed. "Why anyone?" The figure tilted its head, the trees behind it creaking as though leaning closer to listen. "Long before your kind, we were worshipped. Fed with sacrifice. Blood in the soil. Breath in the roots. When you forgot us, when you stopped feeding us willingly, we learned to feed ourselves. You come to us. You give yourselves. And still, you wonder why." Melissa's blood ran cold. The forest was no accident, no curse of nature, it was a predator, ancient and eternal, luring people in like moths to a flame. The legends weren't warnings. They were history. The figure reached out, its hands stretching into a mass of roots and vines. They lashed around Melissa's wrists and ankles, yanking her upward until she dangled helplessly before it. The faces in the trees moaned louder, their voices rising into a chorus of agony and hunger. Melissa thrashed, tears streaking down her face. "I won't let you take me," she screamed, her voice raw. The figure leaned closer, its ever-changing face hovering inches from hers. For a moment, it settled into one form, her own face. Her own eyes, her own mouth, speaking back at her in perfect unison. "You were always ours." With that, the vines plunged into her chest, wrapping around her ribs, sinking into her lungs. Pain exploded through her body as the forest invaded her, filling her veins with fire. Her scream was swallowed by the chorus of voices until her own joined them, echoing endlessly through the grove. And then, silence. The vines lowered her body gently to the ground. Her eyes flickered open, glowing faint red. She rose to her feet, moving stiffly, her expression blank. The Hollow had claimed another vessel. As she stepped into the trees, her voice joined the countless others whispering through the forest. Another face slowly etched itself into the bark of a nearby trunk, her face, mouth frozen in eternal silence, eyes wide in endless terror. Above, the canopy swayed without wind, and the forest seemed to sigh contentedly. Another meal. Another memory to keep. Far away, at the edge of Black Hollow Forest, the sign that warned campers not to enter stood crooked, half buried in weeds. The faded words still barely visible. "Do not stay after dark. They are waiting." But the sign was old, forgotten, ignored. And already, a new group of campers was setting up tents just beyond the tree line.